when you want to start it. So I want to welcome everyone again to the Concord Quarters Climate Action Working Group Disaster Preparation Series. And today we are so thrilled to have two people who have great depth of knowledge around some of the things we're most urgently interested in, which is how to take care of our buildings in the event of extreme weather, including tornadoes, which is going to be the primary focus of our speaker, Rich Heiland, who is a member of Westchester Meeting, and Brian Baer, who's from the Elevated Studio. I love the name of that. I'm not sure if he's going to share a little bit about the background there, but he has a vast experience both in architecture and also in the VOAD system that we heard about in the last session, the Voluntary Organizations Assisting in Disasters, and helping people like us who have buildings that we want to prepare ahead of time so that there aren't catastrophic impacts, but also how we can think about how to approach repair and rebuilding in the event that that's required. So in terms of the flow of today, we're going to start with Brian and talk a little bit about the work he's done. I hope I have that right on my screen in front of me. And he'll have about 20-25 minutes to share. Then we'll have time for questions and answers. And then we're going to probably do a minute, 2-3 minute brain break. And then we'll turn it over to what can we do in our meetings and our facilities to prepare ourselves for the specific event, which is to say tornadoes. We'll wrap up at the end with looking forward to what's happening over the summer. And I really look forward to this. I think this is the program we've all been waiting for. And I'll turn it over to Brian. Thank you, Brian, for being here.
Thanks, Paula, for having me. And thank you all for allowing me to present to you. As Paula had indicated, my name is Brian Baer. I'm the founder and executive director of the Elevated Studio. We are a nonprofit based in Manhattan, New York, not Kansas. Just want to be clear about that, where we're located. And we are a national VOAD member agency. VOAD stands for Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. And these are predominantly nonprofit and faith-based organizations around the country, around the globe, that volunteer their time, energies, and efforts to assist the survivors in the response, recovery, preparedness, and mitigation spokes of the disaster wagon wheel. Those that are not so voluntary are municipalities, county, state, federal offices of emergency management. You may be familiar with folks like FEMA or PEMA, which is the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So those folks, that's their role. They deal with the emergencies. I am an architect by trade, by license. I've been practicing architecture for the better part of 35 plus years, licensed in 14, 15 states across the country. If you have any questions during this presentation, feel free to either raise your hand using the annotation button, or park them in the chat, and I will get to them as soon as I can. I will be sharing this presentation in PDF form. The PowerPoint is a little bit on the large side because of the photos and the video that I'm going to be showing later on, but I will make it available. My contact information is on the screen, and behind that is a photo of what was left of a house after a 36-inch oak tree fell on it post Hurricane Sandy. So not much left. But as an architect, you know, we get to see a beautiful place. So we will take a blank piece of paper or a plot of land that hasn't been touched or has been touched, as in the case of this particular home, and or what's left of this particular home, and rebuild it. And not just rebuild it to what it was, but to rebuild it in a much better condition for weeks and decades and centuries to come. So how do disasters happen? Anyone know how disasters actually happen? Don't worry, there's no right or wrong answer, and there will not be a quiz, so no one's going to pass or fail. But disasters happen by a hazard. So what are hazards? Can anyone give me just a quick little shout out? What's a hazard?
Fire, a storm.
Fire. Sure,
flooding.
fire is a good one. What's another one?
Wind, rain.
Wind, water.
Lightning.
Sure, we'll go with that.
Earthquakes,
Earthquakes.
tsunamis.
That's water. We'll stick with that.
Right.
Yep. Disease and animals, right? So we're living in a hazard right now. We've been living in this hazard for a while, right? Called COVID-19. Animals. I mean, we don't necessarily have the problem with locusts, although the cicadas come out every however many years they come out and make a lot of noise. If you live here in the Northeast, which I'm sure all of us do, stink bugs are a bit of a hazard, right? They're more of an annoyance than a hazard, I should say. So we got all these right? So water, earth, wind, fire, temperature, right? Extreme heat and extreme cold. And what people don't necessarily wrap their arms around is that extreme temperature out of all of these hazards causes the most fatalities across our country, right? So climate change is a real thing. Extreme weather is a real thing. Regardless of what side of the political aisle spectrum you live on, it's here to stay. Unfortunately, we as Homo sapiens have a really horrible batting average against Mother Nature, and it's 0-0-0 for those of you who are baseball fans. But we as design professionals and construction professionals and facility managers have the opportunity to use our massive brain muscle to combat these issues and make our spaces safer for the occupants for years to come. So since 2007, these are all the federally declared disasters. We had a big year in 2011, unfortunately. Another big year in 2017. Couple declared in Pennsylvania last year, in 2020, and how it breaks down in 2020 is that there were 131 emergency declarations, another 104 major disaster declarations, 78 fire management disaster declarations. And then last year, there were 22 emergency, 58 major, and then between 2011 and 2021, there were 15 FEMA declarations in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and 68 undeclared disasters in Pennsylvania since May of 2018. So what's the difference between a declared disaster and an undeclared disaster? Well, declared disasters are things like Hurricane Katrina, the Joplin, Missouri tornado, Hurricane Ida and the tornadoes that came along with it. What are some of the undeclared disasters? The July 12th, 2021 flooding that happened in Bucks County in northern Philadelphia. Hurricane Isaias that happened in Montgomery County, Delaware County, and southwest Philadelphia. A house fire or an apartment fire that displaces over 5 families is considered a disaster, but it might not necessarily be declared by either FEMA, but it may be declared by the Commonwealth. And there are more and more undeclared disasters within each municipality, county, state, in the country versus declared disasters. So just in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, from 4 years ago until today, there's 68 undeclared disasters. That means that FEMA Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency was activated. They activated their Emergency Operations Center. They had a deployment for some period of time. And so that's the sort of the breakdown. How does a disaster get declared? It comes along with the 2018 Disaster Recovery Reform Act that has a dollar threshold based on what that municipality is seeing. That threshold is $10 million. That's the line. So if you are in a municipality or county and you have a disaster and you don't meet that $10 million threshold, you are not going to get a declaration. And it comes into effect more commonly in neighborhoods that are vulnerable, whether there is a high minority population or there is a high elderly population or both, or low income, right? So we think of those three descriptions as the three common denominators of what is going to drive a disaster to be more highly likely to be declared than not. I'm sure we've seen this this chart before, but just to go through it, the federal disaster assistance process starts with voluntary agencies during the response phase: mass feeding, sheltering, emergency assistance, cleanup, mucking and gutting, breaking down trees, etc. Then the property owners, whether it's a municipal building or it's a religious building or it's a private single-family home, they contact their insurance agent and they work through with them to get a claim going. Sometimes the claims are denied, sometimes the claims are accepted. And it's very rarely that it's a one-for-one replacement. Many times the insurance agent will say, no, you're only getting 70 cents on the dollar or 50 cents on the dollar or 85 cents on the dollar. It really depends on what the event is and whether or not your insurance is going to cover that. If there is a disaster declaration, that first blue program, the FEMA programs are gonna come into play. And then the SBA programs would come into play, which is a loan. And for houses of worship and individual property owners, that could be as low as 1.8%, depending on what they apply for. Again, it's a loan, so you have to apply for it, accept it, so on and so forth. Other FEMA programs that come into play are personal property, moving and storage and transportation, private automobiles, business vehicles like a house of worship van, or if a house of worship has a dump truck for one reason or another, that comes into play. And then once all of those first five boxes are done and completed, that's when the voluntary organizations, the VOAD membership agencies like mine, like Liberty Lutheran, like the Salvation Army, like United Methodist Committee on Relief, like Nahama, the list goes on, come in and complete that disaster recovery program. So the 4 or 5 spokes of the wagon wheel when it comes to disaster, right? We have response, which is usually a very small period of time, is usually from that 0 mark from when the actual event happens to about 2, 3, 4 weeks after the event, depending on how large the event is. Hurricane Maria had a response time frame of about 7 to 8 weeks. Then there's the relief phase, which overlaps between response and recovery. That's when you get a lot of people just swooping in, making donations of water and clothing and money and this and that and food, and everyone kind of swoops in. And 70% of all disaster dollars given happens within the response and relief phase. So it could be from, well, it is from that 0 mark of the event to, depending on when that the relief phase ends, it could be as short as 5 weeks. It could be as long as a year. And then after the relief phase, well, then recovery begins. Both the short and long-term recovery, and then it moves into mitigation and then in preparedness, right? So that recovery phase is really what we're going to be talking about today. So recovery, how do we do that? What do we need to be thinking about? How are we going to be preparing our communities to prevent a long recovery period, right? We as the Elevated Studio and our partners, we want to make recovery very, very short. We want to make mitigation easily available to the individual organizations and property owners. And along those lines of mitigation, we also want to be able to prepare the communities for future events. That goes along with education, that goes along with outreach, that goes along with preparing the facility, the brick and mortar, to withstand future climate change. What we try to do as the Elevated Studio is reduce that recovery time from years or decades down to weeks or months. So how do we do that? Well, we combine two words. We combine resilience, which is the capacity to recover quickly from a difficulty. So think of a rubber band. Static rubber band in its resting place is in one piece, right? So you have a rubber band and you're going to stretch it out and stretch it, and you're putting strain on that. And then resilience is just bending it back so that it looks like a rubber band again, right? So it's that time, it's that ability to recover, right? And then sustainability is the ability to maintain that rate at a certain level. So we liken sustainability with green building design. So things like solar panels, things like responsibly harvested wood products, using daylight to light our spaces, using passive heating and cooling to heat and cool our spaces without having to burn fossil fuels, right? So we combine those two and we come up with a word that I like to use. It's 35 points on the Scrabble board without any of the bonuses, and it's called sustain affordability. So basically what that definition is, if it's not sustainable, it's not affordable. And if it's not affordable, it's not sustainable. So you, as representatives of your various meetings, you need to make sure that your properties are not just resilient and not just sustainable, but they're affordable. So everything that you are going to be doing with your meetings, all the decisions that you're going to be making along the way to fortify your structures, fortify your communities, has that sustain affordability mindset to it. Just quick definitions of what response, relief, recovery, mitigation, and preparedness are. I won't get into that. We talked a little bit about that during the wagon wheel. What do we try to do? Well, we take those hazards that are in the tan and society in the green, and we pull them together into the red so that we make that sustainable world away from the hazards and for the betterment of society. What winds up happening, though, is people talk about the various hazards for the longer period of time, depending on the impact, right? So earthquakes, the earth shakes, things move. We talk about it a lot, right? Volcanoes, same thing. These are massive, massive events that occur, but we don't talk about fires all that much. And we don't talk about weather events, storms, winter storms, summer storms, hurricanes, tornadoes. It goes into the news cycle, but it comes out of the news cycle very, very quickly because we don't generally have that attention span. Epidemics, I think with the exception of COVID, has had a lengthy conversation. Just a quick graphic on the types of storms that we've seen. This is a graphic from the years 1980 to 2016. So you can see where in the country you have the highest rate of incidents, right? So Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the Northeast, right? We're talking about flooding, we're talking about extreme cold, we're talking about droughts and heat waves, not so much talking about tropical cyclones, although recently we've had our fair share here in the Northeast. And then the severe local storms, They happen in the Commonwealth, but not nearly as frequently as some of the things that happen in the Midwest. And Rich is going to talk more and more about that during his presentation about tornadoes. 2017 was one of those bellwether years, right, where we had multiple billion-dollar weather events and climate disasters. We had the trifecta of hurricanes between Harvey, Irma, and Maria. We had southeast freezing conditions. We had a litany of nor'easters along the coastline of Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire. We had over 500 tornadoes in the Midwest. We had wildfires throughout the Northwest and the far West. We had drought in the middle of the country. Lions and tigers and bears, oh my. And so what can we do as professionals? Well, we can, again, use our big brain power to make our facilities more fortified to combat those disaster climate events. Here in the metropolitan New York area, where I'm from, we rank statistically as #1 with total population of just over 20 million people. As the population gets older, we have 14, almost 15% of our population right now that is over the age of 60 years. It's about 3 million people. In 2020, that's been bumped up to 15. In 2030, we're projected to having 20% of our population. So 2030 is really not that far away. So what does that mean for our built environment? Well, Hurricane Sandy taught us a lot, right? We had over 80 US casualties. We had 7.5 million people without power. We had a 14-foot storm surge. That's on average. Long Beach, New York, which is a barrier island, barrier community of about 7,000 year-round residents, recorded the highest storm surge at 17 feet. Most single-family homes that we all live in, 2 stories, 4/4 colonial building, 17 feet is the ceiling of the 2nd floor. So think about that. 17-foot wall of water entering your house and the 2nd floor bedrooms. And that's what happened to many homes on Long Beach. It affected 5 million residents just within the New York City region alone, $90 billion in losses. This photo is taken from the World Trade Center complex. Looking north, that bright beacon is the Empire State Building. And before that is the Lower East Side, Soho, Chelsea, in the dark. 1983 was a big year for the codes. As an architect, I'm a bit of a code geek, and we live and die by the building code because that's the rule of law for us, right? We have to design our buildings, whether it's an outhouse, a house, or a courthouse, to the building codes. 1983 is when not just New York City, but most municipalities, state and local, incorporated floodproofing requirements into the building code. 84% of the buildings that were impacted by Sandy were built before 1983. 84%. Huge majority of the buildings were built before 1983. Almost 100% of the buildings that were destroyed were built before 1983. And just under 95% of those buildings were built just before 1983. So if you think of your structures, if you think of your meeting, if you think of your campus and the age of those buildings, and when a flood hits it, what is going to happen? And hopefully we can answer some of those questions and have a nice open dialogue about that. The image on the upper left-hand side of the screen is a pair of homes. The daughter and her 2 children lived in the tan 2-story building on the right. Her father lived in the single-story structure on the left in yellow. That orange line is where the water was, the storm surge. Now, what they tried to do was a few years prior to Hurricane Sandy, they installed spray foam insulation to the underside of the floor cap, or within the floor cavity to the underside of the structure. But what they failed to do was check how many anchor bolts put the building down on top of the foundation. So when you have 6 feet of water on a single-story wood frame house from 1928, what happens to it? It comes off of its foundation, and it got rotated off of its foundation. And then once the water receded, it was lowered onto the foundation, not in the same place, kind of askew. Fortunately, no one was in the building at the time, but it was a lesson learned on what not to do when we're trying to renovate wooden structures. The images below are images at the end of the Rockaway Peninsula that had caught on fire after a transformer had blown, exploded, where 150 homes were lost, not due to storm surge, but due to fire. And because the depth of the water was 5.5 feet, the fire department could not get to any of those houses to save them. So it was a double tragedy. Our partnerships, as we're moving through the process of recovery and response and how best to understand future severe weather patterns, right? National Weather Service, FEMA, Housing and Urban Development Department for the federal, national voluntary organizations active in disaster, and these are just a few of them that are on the list. And why do we do this, right? Why do we really want to think about resilience and sustainability and sustain affordability? Why do we want to make our campuses more fortified? Why do we want to go through the idea of mitigation and preparedness? Well, for every dollar spent now, regardless of the building type, it's going to save around $7 to $8 in future recovery. So think about this for a second. If you're going to spend, and my favorite example of this is a residential or even a commercial air conditioning system where the air handler is in the attic or it's in the basement, and you have a condenser, those little condensers that goes on the outside of the building. You get the black pipes coming in and out. It's usually set down on the grade or on concrete blocks, right? If you take a metal bracket that costs about $120 and you put it on the exterior wall above the flood zone, let's call it 5 feet above grade or 6 feet above grade, and you put the disconnect up on that wall, and you put the condenser on top of that bracket, if there is a flooding event or even a wind event, you won't have to spend $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 or more to replace that unit. So think about that. Spending $120, $150 on a bracket, spending $2,000 to $5,000 on a new condenser. I think that's a pretty good investment. Yes, it's not very attractive, but no one wants to look at a condenser anyway. But for those facilities that do have air conditioning, do have forced air, why not make that investment? It's all for the common good, right? So we take the social aspect of things, we take the economic aspect of things, we take the environmental aspect of things, we bring it into the middle to make that sustained affordability triangle, the trifecta. Why? Because it's smart. It's a smart thing to do. Going down the sustainability and mitigation and adaptability role, it's very important. Being resilient, combining all of those letters together, and what we have is a timeless facility. Something that we can leave to our great grandchildren so that they don't have to do anything but maybe put a coat of paint on the walls, change a light bulb occasionally, maybe change out the hinges on the door because someone puts a block underneath it and now the hinges rack the door, right? We've all been there. But it's smart. It's smart design. It's smart construction. It's smart management. Flood hazards are one of the largest hazards that we all have to deal with, right? Because it doesn't necessarily have to happen along the coastline. It can happen along the riverines as well. Many of the properties that were damaged in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania from Hurricane Ida did not happen along the coastline. They happened interior. They happened in Chester County, in Bucks County, in Montgomery County, and York County. Last I checked, York County is nowhere near the ocean, right? So this flooding happened because of rivers. So should we build in special flood hazards? No, we shouldn't be building in special flood hazards. But if we have a structure that is in a special flood hazard, we have the tools to mitigate that property, elevate that property, move that property, fortify that property, fortify the infrastructure of that property to combat that flooding hazard. We have plenty of resources. FEMA has more and more resources than we can shake a stick at. One of my favorites is the Coastal Construction Manual. This manual is great for really all things related to water and wind. And maybe Rich will be touching on some of these points, but this is a great resource. You can download this, keep it. It's a pretty sizable booklet. I'm going to say 250 pages or so. But it has some very good technical data, and it has some very broad brushstrokes that we can all understand and comprehend. Some other resources about flooding. Let you look at those at your leisure. But so where is the risk, right? So, and these are just some statements that we hear from all of our clients, right? And I want what I want. And what I want is safety. What I want is my life back. What I want is I want to be back in my home, or I want to be back in my school, or I want to be back in my place of worship. I want it to be well built. I want to be made whole. These are some of the things that many of our clients talk to us about. Obviously, some of the other things are related specifically to residential construction, but it's all wood frame, right? And I would imagine that there are properties that you have in your meetings that are wood frame, and maybe some of them are not wood frame. I'll look for some feedback from you on that. So where we were in the past is not very resilient, right? Nothing is resilient. No existing towns, buildings, schools, houses of worship, nothing is resilient. Currently, we're in this middle bar, right? Some things are resilient, some things are not resilient. It's up to us to really figure out how to make that bar higher, right? The rising tide lifts all boats. And where we want to be is in the future, right? Where we are planning for a community, a better world that is resilient, that is sustainable, that can withstand those fluctuations in temperature, that can withstand extreme weather events. Part of that is about accessibility, right? Here in the Northeast, we have a tendency to age in place. And what does that mean? You may have heard it, you may not have not heard that term. So aging in place talks about us, humans, being in a space and staying there for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. My parents, God love them, are still alive, right? And they are living in the house that I grew up in. And they've been there for, 53 years, 54 years. And they have no intention of ever leaving that house. So what can we do to resolve some of those issues, not just on the residential side, right? But also on the non-residential side, houses of worship, schools, municipal buildings, right? We don't want a set of stairs that looks like an Escher drawing or looks like a museum in Paris, France, that has this zigzag ramp that gets you from the main entrance up to the exhibition halls. It's a beautiful structure, it's a beautiful drawing, But this is not what we talk about when we talk about accessibility, and it certainly isn't what we talk about when we talk about universal design. And so what is universal design? Well, it's equitable, right? It's flexible. It's simple and intuitive. It's perceptible information. It's tolerance for equality, right? It's not having tolerance for errors. It doesn't take any real physical effort to move through or move to a space. And those spaces are really designed for all, right? So we're taking resilience, we're taking sustainability, we're taking universal, and we're combining it all together and making it sustainable, affordable for each and every one of us. I want to talk a little bit about a case study right now, if you don't mind. This is a single family home about 150 yards away from the Atlantic Ocean in Long Beach. The storm surge that this home saw was inundating the lowest level, which is the bottom picture, and the upper level had about 1.5 feet in it. Typical home in Long Beach. This is in the West End. The homeowner is a quadriplegic and she has a service dog with her. So fortunately, she was able to evacuate, excuse me. But when she came back, she found 3.5 feet of sand in her lowest level, and about 1.5 inches, 2 inches of sand on her upper level. And you can see where the water line was on the upper level. The water line on the lowest level was the underside of the structure. Because she's in a flood zone, we had to elevate her home. And where is it? There we go. So this is, I'm going to try to make this video work. This is a little time-lapse photography. The whole sequence of elevating this structure in this point took about 6 hours. And I think we boiled it down to a little bit less than that. Oop, maybe not. Yeah, a second. I knew it wasn't going to work. Sorry. You can visit our Instagram page at the.elevated.studio and you can see this video. But in any event, what happens is you will see this house being elevated up a little bit at a time. My apologies that the video isn't working. But this is what it looked like up on cribbing, or the Jenga tower, as we so affectionately call it, with a new foundation underneath it. And then we built a brand new middle level, or first level, as we called it. And this is it under construction. This is some of the interior. The middle picture and that middle door is an interior elevator to allow the occupant to go from the parking level underneath the house to each of the 2 levels above. And this is a shot of the house as it is as it's completed on a rainy summer day. So what can we do as property managers, as design professionals, as engineers, as contractors? Well, we can understand the hazards that may impact your area, right? So in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, not too many earthquakes, but we do have a lot of wind. We do have a lot of rain. We do have a lot of extreme heat. We do have a lot of extreme cold. We do have cyclones, both in the water version and in the wind tornado version. We can create a continuity of operations plan, or a COOP. And you can go to our friends NIDIS, or New York Interfaith Disaster Services. Did that a little backwards, sorry about that. It's nyids.net. And they can help you create a COOP. We can do a resilience, sustainability, universal design assessment, not just of the campus, but of the buildings as a whole. we can save our dollars in a separate fund specifically toward mitigation and preparedness measures. So it could be something simple as taking the windows out of the exterior wall that are just your typical windows, and maybe put impact resistant windows in their place. We could take the boiler, the water heater out of the basement and move it to a higher elevation within the structure. And that way we don't have to worry about water damaging the infrastructure. We can relocate buildings or the infrastructure, or we can fortify those areas. So there's a lot of things that we can do. And again, it doesn't take a lot of effort. It takes a little bit of money, it takes a little bit of willpower, it takes a little bit of forethought to think about where are we going to put these things. But it starts with our big brains. So with that, I want to thank you all. As an architect, we do see a very beautiful place, and it happens right here. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We have a few minutes before we take our brain break. Let's just see if there are any comments, reflections, questions that people would like to ask Brian. Maybe I'm going to suggest that some of us, maybe Debbie and Wilmington or Rosanna and Tom, just say a little bit about your buildings and see if there's any comments he might make about them. Would either Debbie or Rosanna or Tom be willing to share, or even Rich about the Westchester meeting? But go ahead, Debbie.
I'm going to cover Westchester in my presentation. So.
Great, thank you. Debbie, just go ahead and unmute.
Well, we are in an urban area. We have a whole urban block, which the meeting house is well over 200 years old. It's a wood structure, as you said. Our biggest problem right now is we are continually having problems with beautiful old trees coming down and doing damage. Last week we had a big storm that took a branch down, that hit the attics. Now we've got to do roofing repairs yet again. Mm-hmm. We do a lot of roofing repairs. I wonder, I know you're talking about something that's a little bit bigger, but I wonder, we have tree service come in all the time. And luckily we're at the top of the hill, so we don't have water like a lot of our neighbors do. But I wonder if you have ideas too as well on how you prepare for things like tree damage. I know it wasn't one of your 15, but it's wind and water.
It's wind and water, yeah. So great question. Thank you for that. There is a process called Fortified that is published by the National Institute of Building Sciences that I will download during our break, and I'll park it in the chat as a reference point for everybody. Fortified is really geared more toward residential construction, but the same principles apply when we're talking about wood framing, right? So there's a way to reinforce the roof to accommodate or resist future damage, and whether that's through wind or water or penetrations, there are ways to fortify that envelope of the structure, not just the roof, but the walls as well. Obviously, if a 36-inch oak tree falls on a roof, you're going to have a pretty strong roof in order to resist that kind of weight, right? So there's only so much that we can do, but you can analyze what you can do just by performing a quick little audit or analysis of the structure. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. In fact, my neighbor just back here last Sunday night had a huge oak tree come down and destroyed their home, but they had cut out to make an area, flat area outside their back door, and just completely eroded the roots. And we'd had a ton of rain, had big wind, and they lost their house.
Well, let's hold them in the light. Rosanna and Tom, do you want to share a little bit about Middletown?
Sure. So Middletown meeting was probably built in, I want to say like 1842, 1843. It was right around the time of that schism that split up meetings for a while. And it is wood frame and stone. And what was the other question?
Well, our heaters.
Oh, and we have an oil furnace, forced air, in what we call a furnace room, a little sub room dug out underneath the meeting house, because that was certainly an addition after the fact.
Sure.
Yeah.
So for something, and I would imagine that the furnace is ginormous.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty good size.
Yeah. So for something like that, without really looking at it, but just understanding the age of the building and the history of it, there's a couple of suggestions. One is to leave the infrastructure in place and basically build a fortified wall around it.
Okay.
The other thing to do is to spend, a little bit more money and get it out of the basement and move it to a higher elevation on the campus or within the campus. I would imagine that because it's oil, you're probably not getting anything more than maybe 80%, 85% efficiency out of it. But there are opportunities where most municipalities, most states, I should say, do offer grant opportunities for going green. So whether that is solar or wind or geothermal or some combination thereof, you could seek out some assistance from the Pennsylvania Department of Environment and Conservation, I think it's called, DEC, and see if there are any grants available to help increase the efficiency of your power plant.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
What was the department again in Pennsylvania?
I believe it's called DEC, Department of Environment and Conservation. I can look that up and get that to Paula, and she can distribute it.
Thank you.
Right. So I'm going to jump in here just to give a mini summary as a check-in with you, Brian, and then we're going to take our brain break.
Sure.
Listening to you, I feel as though you're telling us we all need to take a really hard look at our buildings in relation to the hazards that we might be facing, and that I think the other key message is it's better to spend some money now than spend a lot more later. And then in terms of the kind of mental checklist that I would be creating from what you said, and this is where I'd love some feedback, but it sounds to me like you're looking at the building envelope, which you're going to include your doors and windows, and what would it mean to replace them with better, both energy wise, but also in terms of resistance to extreme weather.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at your heating and cooling systems and their location.
Mm-hmm.
I also imagine that, though I'm not sure you mentioned it specifically, you're looking at the oh, I lost my train of thought. But I'll just skip to the next one, which was just in terms of if you have a risk for flooding, your choices are, what are your choices? Elevating, fortifying, protecting it from damage. Are there specific things that you would include on anyone's checklist if they're going to be inquiring with someone to do an audit? Building envelope, heating system, doors and windows, location of the heating and cooling system, etc. What else would you add to that?
Yeah, all of that. what is your maintenance for your buildings? And how do you go about maintaining your buildings? Are you taking a bucket of water with a mop and some Pine Sol and just mopping up? What is your routine to maintain your mechanical equipment? Are you changing out a filter in your air handler on a regular basis, or at least cleaning it? Are you getting the burner serviced on your oil-fired boiler on an annual basis or semi-annual basis? I would look at how are you consuming your utilities, water, electricity, and heating or cooling, right? It's not just fortifying the structure and the campus to combat hazards. That's part of it, right? But hazards are very exact events, unplanned naturally, but they're very exact events that happen to a structure and a community or an individual and their house, right? It's the other 364 days out of the year that you have to think about, well, what do I have to do to live, worship, study, love, maintain this building, right? So it's not just, we're going to put a couple of extra nails in the roofing shingles. It's, well, what kind of light fixture should I be putting into this part of the building so that I can help reduce my energy consumption, right? It goes back to that spending $1 now versus spending $20 later.
Great. I wish we could ask you other questions, but I'll stop there. So I am a firm believer that to make it through any program like this, you need to take a brain break. So I would like everyone, you can shut off your screen if you want. I'd like everyone, even if all you do is stand up and turn around or stretch or bend, touch your knees, but everyone take a minute, literally only a minute, and stretch, and we'll be back at 3:55 to hear about tornado, how to handle tornadoes, since we're starting to get them. So come right back in a minute. Delighted to have Rich with us, and we'll turn it back to you. And we look forward to learning how to protect ourselves.
Okay, so I've got my screen share up. I assume everybody can see it. I always have to ask that because no matter how much you use technology, it tricks you. When I go through this, I want you to keep in mind that much of what I'm talking about can also apply to your home. It's not just your meeting in terms of preparing for this. The other thing, like Brian mentioned at the end, I've got my email, I've got everything out. I'm creating a PDF of this PowerPoint, which will be easier for people to have. I also am willing to share our Westchester disaster plan with everybody, but that we put together, but with a caveat that please don't copy it because it needs to be tweaked and done specifically for your meeting. So basically, what you see on this picture is the background is a tornado that I was actually in. And that little building there is the Unity meeting in Quaker City, New Hampshire, in Western New Hampshire near Claremont. And please note that it is a wood building because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But basically, okay. Even all the modern tracking and radar we have, tornadoes are still very unpredictable, kind of like an earthquake's unpredictable or a house fire to a degree, because they're so rapidly forming. You can have a lot of storms that are just perfect for creating a tornado, but they don't. And you can have other storms that may not look that bad, but they'll produce a tornado. What you're seeing there was in Xenia, Ohio at 4:40 p.m. on April 3rd, 1974. It was the day of the tornadoes. There were more than 130 storms, tornadoes throughout the Midwest. The one that struck Xenia, where we lived, we had our first home. We'd had it about a year. Had maximum winds of 300 miles an hour. It destroyed 1,200 homes and businesses. And there were hardly any buildings left downtown. We had 33 people died in this storm and approximately another 1,200 injured, which given the scope of this storm, it still shows up on the Weather Channel. It's one of the biggest of all times. Given the scope of it, we were amazed because I was a reporter at the time and was out looking for, frankly, bodies and destructions, kind of reporting and volunteering. We were constantly amazed after this that we didn't have more casualties than we did, even though what we had was bad enough. That's our house. That's what was left of. My wife was in the house lying on top of a 6-week-old son and our 5-year-old daughter. I had called her to warn her that this tornado was coming. And of course she had the TV on Sesame Street with 2 young kids. She didn't have it on the weather alerts. And growing up in the Midwest, she immediately said, well, I'm going to go to the southwest corner. Well, that doesn't work. That's an old myth, particularly in a slab home, which this was. So I said, no, go to the laundry room. It's short wall construction. And she did. And that would have been, if you can see my pointer, kind of down this hallway. But after I finally got to our house, which took me over an hour, this is what I saw. And obviously, my reaction was, I don't have a family anymore. I'm surprised they made it through. The town lost half its schools. We had at least 2 churches totally destroyed and numerous ones damaged. This is a view taken in our downtown area of Xenia the day after the tornado. And this, our newspaper where I worked, we lost our roof. We had no power, but we still published on time the next day. We had press guys up on the roof spreading tarpaulins. We printed a sister paper 45 miles away. We couldn't run our routes. So we just dropped bundles of paper free and told people to take them. I'm mentioning this because we didn't have a plan. We had no plan for anything. The town didn't have a plan. We didn't have tornado sirens. It just happened. And we were able to do a lot of things at the paper. I love the publisher put this thing on it. The Gazette's a little late. We were about an hour late getting them into town the next day. We had great leadership. We had a phenomenal publisher, and we had a great staff, and things just happened and we did it right. But I want to stress, we didn't have a plan. Now, we're going to talk about your meeting and what to do, and I'm going to use our meeting, Westchester, as an example, although it may not be typical. It's a big meeting physically, not so much anymore with all us old people along, but it's a big meeting physically, and it's a part of a campus, which, Brian used that term. We have the Westchester Friends School, which is up through middle school, and we have the Hickman, which is a retirement center, is all part of our campus. So on that level, some of what I say may not apply to you, but I do want to touch on this because I know the nature of a lot of the meetings. This picture on the left is Warrenton meeting in Wellsville, Pennsylvania. It's where my wife and I went from 90 to 95 when we lived in Hanover, Pennsylvania. Original part of it, 1763, it's all stone construction. It's a primitive meeting, meaning we heat with wood stoves. We light with coal oil lamps. So a big part of our disaster planning was having numerous fully charged fire extinguishers around. This is Bradford meeting here in Chester County, another primitive meeting, also stone. This is an interior shot on the right of the inside of Bradford. Now, are these old buildings safe? And my answer is, yeah. Stone construction, particularly with beam inside, yes. But finding safe spots in a lot of these old meetings is tricky, and I'm going to talk about that. And because so many of them are just open, there's really nowhere to hide. And the one thing that we're not going to recommend is that everybody start running out of buildings. You're better to shelter in place, even if it's not a good place, than you are to start running around. Now, generally, what's not safe when it comes to refuge, I'm going to start with that first. Generally, if you have a large open area with windows, it's the least safe. This is our meeting house. And this is where we actively meet now. This room is used for concerts and events. And in the old days, when the men were on one side and the women on the other, this whole thing came down. There's a pulley system that comes down. It's kind of neat. But you can see this is a huge 2-story environment with brick walls, and no matter how well it's built, these things can be susceptible to twisting in the wind, and stuff can start flying around. We could still lose the roof even if the walls stayed up. So this would be kind of the last place that I would want to shelter in our building. Likewise, this is in our social room. We have plenty of windows, and we also have a skylight. So it's a big open room. It's actually the original old meeting house that was built in the 1830s. That's probably not where we would want to go. This is our storage room. We probably would not, obviously I want to get this, don't go up, don't go to 2nd story levels, don't go outside. This has a lot of stuff that would blow around. The same with our kitchen, stuff would blow around. Now I want to mention the old adage about the southwest corner of a building. We found one family dead in their basement in Xenia because they went to the southwest corner. Well, their house got picked up and blown away, and the house next to them got dropped into their basement. Even if you go to the basement, you want to go to the center of the basement. You want to try to find short wall construction, and you don't want to get under anything heavy. So for example, if we went to a basement, we would not want to get under all this kitchen stuff because sometimes they come through the floor. So I want you to just keep in mind the phrase short wall construction, no glass. So what are the safest options? Ideally, if a basement, if you have a full basement, go to it. This is our basement, and I only have one picture of it. I should have taken the other picture. This actually is on our patio, and it looks like an old-fashioned storm cellar. In fact, this is the only way into our basement. You have to unlock it and throw the thing open, and then you can go down the basement. Partial basement or storm shelter. If you have a little rural meeting house, actually investing in one of the old-fashioned storm shelters like Dorothy didn't make it to in The Wizard of Oz is not a bad idea. If you have any secondary buildings that might be safer, don't have glass in them. So what are the safest options? Well, in our meeting, this is it. This is a bathroom in the interior, short wall construction. Things are anchored like the toilet, and there's no glass except for the mirror. Problem, it doesn't hold a lot of people. 6 or 7 people probably max. We might average 20, including some children and handicapped folks at our meeting. So this is good, but it poses a problem. Now, this is my wife. She's sitting here going, oh my God. If you don't have any other options, this is what we would probably do. We all have these benches that were built 100 years ago or more by very skilled craftspeople. And if you've ever tried to move them, you know how heavy they are. So we would suggest, particularly if you have these mats, lying down, this is my wife demonstrating, grabbing the mat, pulling it over and covering yourself. Now, what this protects you from, obviously, in our meeting room is flying glass, stuff coming down if the roof goes off, that sort of thing. It's not ideal, but what we're doing with our plan is we're saying, okay, if we have to do this, that frees up the bathroom for the kids and the handicapped people. We do have one elderly person in a wheelchair. We can get them to that bathroom that I just showed you. Now, under one of the things that we're doing is we're talking a lot about paying attention to weather. First of all, the odds of you being hit in your meeting at 10:30 on a Sunday by a major tornado are pretty slim. They may not even show up statistically, but I like to tell people that this is not likely until it happens. Then when it happens, it's very, very likely. I mean, when I went home for lunch on the day of our Xenia tornado almost 50 years ago, I had no idea I wouldn't have a home to have supper in. But that's what happened. And I will add, since one of you talked about trees, We moved back up here in March of last year, and then January of 2021, before we moved, we had a 10-second downburst. We had a big storm go through, wasn't a tornado, downburst that planted a 75-foot pine tree on our house. $40-some thousand worth of damage. That was not a tornado, but the impact was probably worse or just as bad as if we'd been in one. So keep in mind that when I'm talking weather here, I'm talking about severe weather. When we built our house back, Brian mentioned this earlier. It was interesting. I didn't tell the guy to do this, but when the city inspector came to look at the part of the house we had rebuilt, he said, wow, this actually is way over our current code. And I asked the roofer, and he says, yeah, he said, it may not protect you from another pine tree, but it's going to protect you from everything else, probably. At least having structural damage, might have some shingles gone. So here's what you need to understand. A tornado watch is simply when conditions are favorable. You can still get some bad weather, straight line winds, a lot of damage, even if you never evolve up into a tornado. So be prepared. And I'm going to talk about that in kind of a checklist in a moment. A tornado warning is when you've got that right on top of you. The Weather Service has found something on radar that shows a tornado may be in the process of forming, or they may actually have a eyewitness of a visual of a tornado coming down. So that's action time. Even if it's miles away, you take this very seriously. Now, if bad weather is coming, what do you do? Well, oops, I want to go back. I need to go back. How do I do that? Okay, hang on. I need to get back. Okay, no, there you go. Now, what I say is the chances of striking it are slim. You know, the odds aren't there, but did you watch the Kentucky Derby this year? I mean, who would have thought? If you have alerts for severe weather coming into the area and you don't feel like you have a lot of good sheltering spots, you might want to actually consider canceling meeting entirely for that morning. At least just don't have people in the building. You may still have building damage, but you won't have people there. In this day and age of Zoom, if you've been doing meetings on Zoom, you can consider Zoom. But my thing is, if it's really looking bad, if Hurricane Schwartz is saying it's going to happen, please consider canceling your meeting. But if you have a meeting, what we're suggesting is, in our meeting, we're going to designate one friend to monitor weather on their phone. This is going to be our weather monitor. And at the beginning of that particular meeting, we'll actually review the safety procedures. We need to unlock our basement. So somebody will have already been designated to get the key and actually unlock that before the meeting so that it's ready to go. We also have an access code to get into the main building of the Friends School, which has a basement. So if this thing is like, it was spotted 20 miles away from Westchester, moving northeast, we may actually have time to make the decision to go over to the Friends School. But again, someone will have that code. We're not putting it in our disaster plan for security reasons, but there will be somebody with that code and our basement will be unlocked. Be aware of anyone in your meeting who has any physical or mental conditions that may require that you actually assist them in an emergency and maybe designate someone to watch over them. We have somebody in a wheelchair and we're going to have to get that person to their own special place. And at the first word of an active tornado, you implement this. When it goes from watch to warning, you're implementing all this stuff. You're going to go to your safe areas and you're going to stay there until there's an all clear from a reliable weather source. Now, if you do experience a tornado, once it's passed, you need to respond. And I'm not going to go into the levels of detail that Brian did, but basically whoever has charge of your meeting or is your disaster coordinator needs to assess the health of the meeting. First of all, people. If you've had people in the building, if it's hit during meeting, everything you want accounted for. Are there any injuries? Everybody should somewhat remain in place while designated friends access the facility. And by this, one of my concerns is that often in the wake of a storm like this, electrical wires may be damaged inside your building, exposed, they could still be live. And in the case of our kitchen, we have a gas stove and we also have gas heat. So we could have, if we had a gas line ruptured and we had live wires, that's not a good combination. So somebody needs to be inspecting it. In fact, I'm going to even have in our disaster plan that if we have time, someone shuts down the electrical panel and makes, and even the gas cutoff valve. So there's a lot to think about depending on your meeting. Now, before anybody comes out, the general safety of the building should be determined. Are there hanging rafters, broken glass, any things that could injure people moving around, particularly kiddos? If there are injuries, 911 should be called immediately, but I'm just going to tell you in advance, if it's a major storm with widespread damage and injuries, you may not get a response. So having a first aid kit and having members of the meeting actually trained in basic treatment could be critical. You know, that even, you know, that can involve things like shocking someone if they have a heart attack. I mean, people having that equipment, having people trained. If 911 will be delayed, consider driving anyone seriously injured to the emergency room if there are passable routes. Just use care in moving them. Hopefully, again, none of this happens, but it's the kind of stuff you need to think ahead on. Now, use cell phones after the storm's passed to try to find out as much as you can about regional damage. If it's feasible to allow people to leave and go to their homes, fine. That's exactly what they should do. Now, if the building is functional, you may have people members of the meeting who lost their homes. Our building, particularly if it's sound and not damaged, with our kitchen, our restrooms, we can shelter people. And if our facility is functional, but homes in our neighborhood right around us are damaged, we're even going to consider opening up the church as temporary refuge for people. Now, some logistics, which Brian kind of got into. Designate someone to take pictures of the building and exterior if there's damage. This should be done before any cleanup, and this is to document for insurance purposes. Now, I'm going to say a few words about insurance before I end here. Brian mentioned it. Make sure that you are reviewing on that audit that he mentioned, your insurance policies every year. Make sure that your insurance coverage ties to the construction costs in your area. For example, right now where we are, because of supply chain issues from COVID, we've seen big increases in lumber and all kinds of construction. And so because of those costs, the insurance that we thought was dandy a year ago may not be. So one of the things we're doing is reviewing all of our insurance. Make sure that if somebody put a policy in place years ago, that the terms of that policy still apply, because some insurance policies have changed because of the increase in disasters. Some things that were rare 20 years ago and may have been covered, may not today. So you've got to make sure you're on top of that. And I've even gone so far as to suggest with some of my private clients in my consulting business that they actually find a contractor. I work with private practice optometrists. I said, find the best contractor in your area and offer him, her, and their entire family free eye exams and glasses every year to have you first on the list for the repair jobs. I don't know, I have no idea what a Quaker meeting might offer somebody, but you know, think about that you need, if you've had any work done and you got a contractor you like, have conversations with them about, hey, Joe, could you kind of boost us up a little bit when it comes time? So basically what I'm going to do is I can provide anybody who emails me with a PDF of this. That's my email up there. I can send it to Paula or anybody else and they can farm it out. And like I said, I'll provide a Word doc of our tentative plan. We haven't adopted it at a business meeting yet. But again, if you look at our plan, please tailor it to your meeting. It should give you some things to think about, but every meeting's unique. Every meeting has different situations. And so tailor to yours. And with that, I will stop screen sharing and put it back out.
Thank you so much. I am so sorry that you had to lose your house and go through the momentary trauma of imagining that you'd lost your family, but we are all benefiting from your life experience since you've obviously made this really part of who you are and what you do for the community.
My wife had the tough part. I was out running around taking pictures and being a reporter, and it took me an hour. This is how dumb you get. It took me an hour to coordinate the scope of the damage and realize, holy, I just lost my house.
Yeah.
It hit me much later because I had the reporter's adrenaline flowing. And
Yep, and that's part of the spiritual care and nurturance we'll be talking about. How does this actually affect us as, you know,
Absolutely.
I would also suggest, of course, this gets into the weeds a little bit, but to have a plan, because the last thing that you need to do is to think about things like cutting off gas supplies and getting somebody with a lot of big wrenches. Fortunately, we had a pipeliner that lived in the neighborhood, and he went around with his tools and cut off all the gas supply. But I did yell at him a little bit. I said, Joe, don't smoke.
He was
an
smoking.
avid smoker, you know, and you just go, oh, geez.
well, we were lucky. Our storm was so big that it took out the power plant coming into town. So we had no electricity, and that was good because the storm, when it ripped up trees and houses, ripped up gas lines right out of the ground. And that's what he was going around the whole neighborhood at public utility things, turning them off because the whole neighborhood was getting saturated
And
with
then the
gas.
other part of that was when I poked my head up after the noise was gone, I had power lines from the roof that I didn't have anymore all over me.
Yeah,
And if they had been live,
yeah, it would not have
it
been
would not
good.
have been a good idea.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Well,
again,
I want to jump in here to say we did have a specific question, and then I'd like to turn it
Okay.
over to the other folks. Which could you just really be very concrete about what does a short wall construction mean?
well, if you're in your house, and let's say you have a utility room with your washer and dryer in it in your house, that's a good example. That's where Connie and the kids went because, you know, the washer and dryer were anchored. They literally pipes in the wall. And tornadoes are rotating winds. They tend to whip things. Very strange storms. When I came home, when I got to the house again after midnight, after we'd gotten them out and safely out of town, I noticed that my coffee cup, which I had a cup of coffee at noon at lunch, was still on the kitchen counter without a bit of dust in it. I could have picked it up and drank it. These are weird storms. The house next door was basically gone, except the dining room table, which had been set for supper, was still there with all the plates and dishes on it. So nothing about a tornado makes sense, but they twist. And so the less they have to twist, the better. It's not like a hurricane, which is straight winds one way, then the eye, because we were in 2 or 3 of those in Texas. And so short, if you have like in your home a half bath.
So you really literally mean a wall that's not.
I mean a wall that
Right.
probably ideally is no more than like 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet. And that's kind of what our bathroom is. But again, in the meeting house, but we can get limited people in there. That's why we have the basement. We even have the friend school next door, but this requires planning. And that's why we're designating. If we think we have a good chance of a violent storm, whether it's going to turn into a tornado or not, my suggestion is we cancel meeting.
Mhm.
If we go ahead and have it and this comes up, and our designated storm watcher says, hey, we just got a tornado warning, there's something moving towards Westchester, we got to be ready to go. And that's why before the meeting, the basement will be unlocked. If we have severe weather watches, we will have advised people, somebody will be designated to take our wheelchair friend to the bathroom because we can't get him to the basement. You know, all that's done in advance.
Yeah, I really appreciate the level of detail and thought that you put into this. And I know I've seen nodding during your presentation, and we're all paying very close attention, but I'd love to see, does anyone else have any other questions or comments for Rich before we wrap up? And we're so
Hey.
glad to have you. We know you're not going anywhere. Debbie?
Yeah, so Rich, when you started on this project at Westchester to get this disaster plan, what was the impetus? How did you get people interested enough to say, like, this is something we have to do right now?
Basically Paula and a series of meetings and you know, I was kind of fortunate in the sense that I did go through that tornado, and a part of my, after I got out of journalism, I had a consulting firm, and a part of my consulting was with businesses on this sort of thing. And with our optometry group, which had 200 members, I actually did a series of programs on disaster preparedness and response for optometry practices. And I was, when I was absent from Quaker meeting in Texas, in East Texas, I was actually ended up being president of a Unitarian congregation. And we did a disaster plan there because we went through Hurricane Harvey, where we had 22 inches of rain in 24 hours. We went through Hurricane Ike. And even though we weren't flood prone where we were, our church, we had massive trees around us. It was called Thoreau Woods for a reason. We were in the woods and straight line winds. And so we did a pretty extensive, you know, plan for that church. So I'd already been thinking about this. And of course, when Paula started this, we didn't have like 15 people jumping up and down saying, I want to do this. So it just kind of worked out. And that's why if I send, you know, everybody, if anybody wants a copy of what we're working on, it's a good template. You're going to have to adapt it, because if you have a single room, you know, 200-year-old meeting house, you're not going to have some of the things we have in ours.
What I want to lift up, Debbie, is I think you're saying, how can we get more of our members and attenders interested in this? And if am I reading you right there? Like you're curious about that. So I do think we're all facing this challenge, and we just have to keep reinforcing the urgency of it, and maybe giving examples from Brian's presentation or Rich's presentation might help people. Are there any other questions for Rich before
I just want to say,
wrap up?
going back to Debbie's point, if you have a meeting where you don't really have a committee or anything working on this, and you have an interest, just do it and take it to them and say, hey, I've been thinking about this. Here's what I came up with. Be proactive about it.
Mhm.
The worst that's going to happen is they're going to say, you know, but they shouldn't, because the reality is this got started with a climate change thing. And I can speak to that very easily in Texas. We lived there in the 90s and we moved back in 2006. Weather was different. I'm sorry. It was totally different. A lot more, not necessarily hurricanes, but
Fire.
tropical storms and heavy rains. And, you know, give you an example, in 1990, in the 1990, when we left Texas, you couldn't grow a palm tree north of Houston. Now they sell them 70 miles north of Houston. When we went back in 16 years, the line where you could grow a palm tree had moved 70 miles. So if anybody's going to tell you climate change isn't real, nah, it is.
And
Yeah.
we saw a lot more straight line storms.
A lot
too.
more straight line storm winds, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to say I love your proposal. Do a draft and bring it to your meeting. I think we've all begun with the interest of engaging people so that they have a sense of ownership. And I know I'm trying to find people who will do the inventory of what we have in the meeting. Who'll go around and take those before pictures, and who might make the list of who's in a wheelchair and who should we be calling, because it's likely that it won't happen at the meeting. I'm with you, although as you said, it doesn't happen till it does happen, but we still want to be actively engaged with our communities to say, is everybody okay? And if everybody's okay and our meeting's okay, then what can we offer the community? And you gave us some great examples of that. So I will pass on your draft to everyone who's interested, and I've included copies of other drafts in our folder. So that's what I'd like to go to now. Rich, I'll give you one more.
Wait for a second before you do that, because I'm updating the draft for our meeting, and I'm going to have that early in the week. And then I'll send you a PDF of this PowerPoint, which is a much better way to send it than the actual PowerPoint.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want to just share kind of what's happening next for those of us who are engaged in this as an actual exercise to be ready. Just remind you that next month we don't have an informational session similar to this. It's on June 14th. It's our chance to exchange ideas, say what we have done, what we're doing next. And for those of you who are trying to advance so that we're really done by the end of the summer, we're asking everybody to start looking at creating the paperwork around the plan that's related to who our partners and local resources are. I think we should have Brian on that list and other places he might direct us to. We also, task 7 is what's our decision-making process? Who decides, as Rich said, you know, he has who's got the code and who's got the, you know, the key to get into the basement. Who triggers that? Who says, yep, now we're going? So we need a decision-making process, and there are forms in the Lutheran handbook to guide us. And then the last thing, which also got mentioned, at least parenthetically, was communication plan. Who's actually reaching out to whom, and who has a responsibility to do 911? Who's speaking to the press if that's relevant, etc. So those are the 3 tasks that we're now, I hope, moving on to if you've completed the earlier tasks that we had for the early part of the spring. And then on the 23rd of July is our last formal session, and that is a focus on emotional and spiritual care, both for members and attenders, but also if we need to, for any ministries that we have in the community, or if we're going to provide care to a wider audience. So that's on July 23rd. That's a Zoom meeting again. On June 14th, also a Zoom meeting. And I am really looking for someone who would host the June 14th meeting with me, because I will be somewhere where I'll have erratic or unpredictable internet. So is there anybody who'd be willing to help me with that on June 14th to co-host? Thank you, Debbie. So I want to say, without crying, that how grateful I am for the modeling that Brian has done in his lifetime with his colleagues of actually giving people new life after a really catastrophic and tragic event, and to Rich for being willing to share right here in Concord Quarter with us your experience and your direct life experience of facing that kind of catastrophe. Unfortunately, many of us don't wake up until it's already happened. So it's really important to hear the stories that both Brian and Rich shared with us. And I hope we can all light little safe fires under as many people as possible to join us in this work for their own homes and for their meetings. So thank you so much. And thank Bianca.
Paula, we
for
do
helping.
have a question. We have a question also. Pat Libby has her hand up.
Okay, you got the last word, Pat.
I'm sorry, I'm a member of Germantown meeting, and I would like to send a copy of this webinar to the head of the meeting and the people who are responsible for all of this in my meeting. Is it going to be available? Can you send me, connect to the copy of, I take it you're being copied, right? This
Yep.
whole thing.
Pat, I would be more than happy to send you the link once it's posted.
Thank
And
you
I'm
very
happy
much. I
to
would
send you
appreciate
information about the series as a whole.
it.